unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. I'm here today with David Courtwright, who is an emeritus professor of history at the University of North Florida, also the author of a number of books. Most recent book is called The Age of Addiction: How Bad Habits Became Big Business, preceded by a couple other books. This one's called Forces of Habit, Drugs in the Making of the Modern World, and this one, A Violent Land, Single Man and Social Disorder from the Frontier to the Inner City. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Greg.
So look, I mean, this book is about addiction, and it's kind of hard to draw contours around this concept of addiction. In fact, the bigger you make it, the more you're going to get accused of, diagnosis creep, right? I mean, we talk about the addiction to everything. It used to be that addiction was limited to things like, hard drugs, maybe alcohol and cigarettes. But it seems like now we're talking about the addiction to gambling, addiction to your phone, addiction to Instagram, right? I think you recounted the story about some guy in China who cut his hand off because he was addicted to gaming. I mean,
Yes.
That's a rather extreme way of dealing with your addiction. But I mean, does this idea of addiction have a coherent boundary? Is this a province of sociology, or is this a province of medicine when we talk about addiction?
It's both. Addiction is socially constructed. It's something that expands over time, but it turns out there is a biological foundation for this. I was initially skeptical. I came up in the 70s and 80s, and I was a researcher of drug and alcohol history, and I thought that addiction was about heroin and cocaine and alcohol and tobacco. And then I've encountered all of this talk about these different forms of addiction. And I started looking into it. And the question was basically, is this just hype or is this real? And the more I looked into it and the more I studied the neuroscience behind it and the economics and the sociology of it, I became convinced that yes, we are living in an age of addiction. Addiction is becoming more conspicuous and more commonplace and more varied.
Mm-hmm. But also, I mean, the language of addiction seems to have replaced the language of vice, right? I mean, we used to, use moral language, and now we use more, medical language. Does that matter? I mean, is that just sort of a change in terminology, or does that have consequences for how we address what we think of as a serious problem?
I think the language of vice is still around, and certainly the language of addiction is flourishing. The way I think about this is that vice is a subset of pleasure, and addiction is a subset of vice. One can be overweight without being addicted to food, for example. There are all kinds of bad habits that we indulge, but it's just silly to say that everyone who ever indulges in those bad habits is addicted. So when you cash this out, addiction looks like the end point on a spectrum of excessive consumption. It's when you really get into trouble, both in terms of individual harms and social harms.
So, I mean, should we be thinking about addiction as just, one end of some Aristotelian distribution of behavior? I mean, there are probably people who drink a lot who aren't alcoholics, and maybe there are people who are alcoholics who might even drink less on certain circumstances. I mean, is to what extent does addiction is it isomorphic with excess?
So the Greek concept that I like, or I found helpful in thinking about addiction, is the idea of hormesis, which is a biology or medicine-based concept, which basically says, look, there are stressors in the world, there are toxins, but paradoxically, these toxins or stressors can be helpful to an organism at low doses, but when you exceed a certain dose, that's when they become poisonous. And even to the point of causing the death of the organism. And it's just a commonplace in medicine. If you have congestive heart failure and you go to a physician and he or she prescribes digitalis or a similar drug, what they're trying to do is they're trying to titrate the dose up to the point where you get the maximum benefit and not beyond that, to where it starts doing you more harm than good. And addiction is almost by definition a state in which you've reached the point where you've gone beyond any kind of a beneficial dosage and you've entered the realm of toxicity. And the deeper you go into that realm, the more harm you cause.
So the poison is in the dose?
Or in the frequency. So to use the example of computer games, so what? If you do Wordle, once a day and spend 5 or 10 minutes on it, if you're doing that 8 or 10 hours a day, then you don't say "so what" anymore.
Yeah, but I mean, when we think about the harm, I mean, the harm is relatively, I guess, easier to measure than the benefit. I just saw in today's newspaper, they were talking about blood alcohol levels and the limits, legal limits on blood alcohol levels to be defined as, drunk driving. And in some countries, they're reducing it from, 0.08 to 0.05. And the article said, science supports the reduction in the limits because it leads to impaired decision-making and so forth. But, I mean, science does no such thing. I mean, science tells you that it's harmful, but, I mean, science has nothing to say about the benefits that one gets from drinking, does it? I mean, how do we evaluate the trade-offs?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with you on that. I think that there are examples of scientific investigation of alleged benefits versus risks. Now, if you're talking about somehow quantifying internal benefits, oh boy, I've got a nice buzz on from this glass of Bordeaux, and then comparing that to lost years of life or something like that. You're right. I mean, that's an apples and oranges comparison. But there are other kinds of investigations that you can carry out that do quantify the harms. And then it becomes, I guess, a kind of existential question for the individual as to whether it's worth it or not. I mean, you can, with some accuracy, estimate the loss in life expectancy for somebody who's a 2-pack a day smoker. Now, the problem from a sort of political economy standpoint is this. It's not just, is it worth it to the individual? What are the externalities that are borne by society in terms of lost wages, lost productivity, in the case of intoxicants, accidents, and so on. So you have to factor that in as well. And those things are quantifiable.
Now, you use the term limbic capitalism, and I don't think this is a new phenomenon. You said that while we've sort of turbocharged addiction and addictive behaviors and products and vice in recent years, I mean, it's always been there, right? People have always sort of made money from supplying these things which become addictive. I mean, to what extent should we be thinking of, if we think there's a rise in addictive behaviors, and I guess that's an empirical, I don't know whether we could answer that empirically, but if there was, I mean, would this be primarily a supply phenomenon, or is it more of a demand phenomenon?
I think it's about supply and technological innovation, and also marketing plays a turbocharging role in this story as well. But what I do in the book is I try to tell the story of the age of addiction in the context of a larger kind of big history story of the quest for pleasure, because that's where this really comes from. I mean, human beings have always been looking to expand their repertoire of pleasures. And nothing wrong with that. Life is hard. Life has been hard. Life was even harder for our distant ancestors. And so that people should discover brewing, that they should discover tobacco, that they should discover psychoactive plants, that they should use those for both pleasure and for ritual purposes. None of this is surprising. And in fact, the first chapters of the book show how there was a kind of expansion throughout time in the pleasure resources that were available. Now, a subset of those pleasures were or became controversial and came to be labeled vices. And that was especially true in the industrial age, when suddenly it's possible to churn out huge quantities of cheap booze and then sell it as a trade good in Africa and all the rest of it. That becomes controversial. And that's why you get a pushback in the late 19th and the early 20th century, where for the first time, reformers, both religious conservatives and left progressives, start questioning the harms that are being caused by this mass commodification of these limbic capitalist goods. Long story short, the reformers lost. And the last 50 or 60 years have just represented a huge surge, not only in the traditional mass-produced limbic capitalist temptation goods, but now we have a whole new array of goods, I guess the best known of which is digital pastimes, everything from gaming to pornography.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about gambling, I recall a time when gambling was actually illegal in a lot of states. I lived in North Carolina, and they didn't even have a state lottery. I mean, in the 1990s, and now, I mean, is there anywhere in the United States where you don't have slot machines within, easy driving distance?
Oh, listen, it's so bad in Florida, I don't even know how you play the lottery. If you walk up to the counter in the convenience store and there are like 17 different games you can play, I really wouldn't know where to begin. I mean, the whole thing has proliferated from basically nothing in the early 1960s in the United States to every state having not only one lottery, but all kinds of lotteries. Sure. And that's one of the arguments in the book, is that limbic capitalism is not simply a regressive social system that's created by a handful of sinister entrepreneurs, but it's also a story of the alliances that those limbic capitalist entrepreneurs have built, not only with criminal enterprises in some cases, but with states, because states derive revenue, lots of revenue, from these enterprises. And yet, these same enterprises pose a threat to public health and well-being. And that's the balancing act. That's the policy problem. Where do you draw the line in terms of regulation in order to reap revenue, yet at the same time contain this so that it doesn't become a massively disruptive problem?
But look, I mean, there's going to be some people, libertarians, I guess, who would say, we've seen an expansion of consumer options that's been going on for hundreds of years. We have more options with respect to housing. We have more options with respect to automobiles, more, options with respect to reading material. What's the problem with having, more options with respect to how we enjoy our free time, right? We used to have to sit at home and play cards. And now we have the television, and then now we have online gaming, and we can hang out on Facebook and Instagram, right? Why isn't this seen as progress?
I think that's a great question, and in one sense, it is. And in fact, I make that argument in the book: is that new forms of pleasure are a form of progress. And I also make the case for the generally beneficent effects of commerce. I mean, I just come right out and say it. Look, you don't want to live in a town in which there's one hardware store, and that one hardware store is run by the state. Nobody wants that. I would agree with the libertarians on that point, or if not libertarians, at least people who advocate free markets. The real problem is that we're talking about different kinds of economic goods. So if you're talking about a rake or a plow or railroad tracks or something like that, yes, of course, you want the best quality merchandise at the lowest cost, and free market delivers that. But when you're talking about heroin or tobacco or games that are designed to get a real hook into you, especially young people, or you're talking about pornography, or you're talking about digitized gambling, to use your example, that's really in a different category in terms of the individual harms that it generates, as well as the social externalities that it generates. So that's, I think, the key regulatory problem. It's not just, do you regulate everything? It's, is there a special category of goods that, for reasons of public health and individual well-being, merit special attention, particularly onerous regulation, or even, in some cases, prohibition?
I mean, should we be thinking about different addictions as substitutes or complements for one another? I mean, I think in the book you talk about how there is a school of thought which says that, you know, these things come together, and, you know, if you go to the gambling house, then next thing you know, you're going to be drinking heavily, and then, you know, pretty soon you'll be hanging out with prostitutes and so forth. But there's another way of thinking about it, which is that, you know, these addictions replace other addictions, right? So, you know, we've seen this huge uptick in phone addiction, but it seems to be accompanied by a decline in smoking, right? So people, when they were waiting for the bus, they would, you know, light up a cigarette. Now, when they're waiting for the bus, they take a look at their Facebook. Should we think of these as, I mean, is there sort of a law of thermodynamics which says there's only a certain amount of time that people are going to spend on addictions, and we're just going to substitute a new one for an old one?
Yeah. So I know you've been doing podcasts for a long time, and so you know it's possible to hold two contradictory thoughts in your mind at the same time. And it turns out both of these things are true. So one of the things I realized as I was writing the book is that it's not just a history of pleasure, vice, and addiction. It should be a history of pleasure, vice, and addiction milieu. So I've become fascinated by what I call pleasure meccas. There are places which bring together any number of intensely pleasurable activities, which, you know, in neuroscientific terms, something that produces the burst release of dopamine. And so, boy, you go into a casino in Las Vegas, or at least a few years ago when they still allowed smoking, you go into a Las Vegas casino, and there are people lighting up cigarettes, and they've got a drink in their hand, and they're standing in front of the video poker machine, and they're doing all of those things scientifically. That is by design. That casino is making money from the booze and the gambling and the other activities that are going on. So it's a kind of limbic capitalist Disneyland. On the other hand, the point about substitution is also true. So the classic example is, what happens when you quit smoking? Answer: you start craving candy and you start gaining weight. And sure enough, consuming more sugar is a substitute for not consuming the nicotine. So that happens too. And so there is a kind of transference that goes on as part of the process.
Right. I mean, and so is it fair to say that the addiction is on the rise? I mean, when we look back at frontier society, I mean, you know, people were engaged in all sorts of behaviors that we no longer engage in. Is there a way to track this? I mean, how would we evaluate the extent to which a society is more prone to or less prone to addiction across geographies or across time?
When you say in frontier societies that people were doing other kinds of things, what were you referring to?
You know, going to saloons and, I don't know, engaging in, I guess, vices like violence and so forth.
Okay, so the answer to that question from an empirical point of view is yes, you can track the rise and fall of the consumption of potentially addictive products over time, in some cases with a fairly high degree of accuracy, because you have things like import data, excise data, and so on. And so you can reconstruct per capita alcohol consumption in the United States for about 2 centuries. And it was very high in the early 19th century. It went down during the temperance era. It came back up in the early 20th century. It went down during the early years of Prohibition. It rose again in the 30s, 40s, 50s, leveled off in the 1980s. You can do all of that. And likewise with gambling. You just gave a very good example earlier. There used to be practically 0 state lotteries, and now every state has got some form of gambling. You can measure these things, but the harder question is, in totality, are we spending more of our time in pastimes to which we are either actually addicted or potentially addicted? Because that's another thing we have to be aware of, is that, again, there is a spectrum of consumption, and one thing that happens quite often, for example, with alcohol, is a person will be a daily drinker, a steady drinker, and will have 2 or 3 drinks of alcohol every day for a long period of time, and then at some point in his or her life, bang, then they suddenly take off into uncontrolled compulsive use. So it can explode into addiction at some point. So I would simply say that there are more hooks in the ocean right now. If you think of limbic capitalism as a business system that dangles baited hooks into the water, and not everybody gets caught. In fact, most people who partake of a potentially addictive product or service don't become addicted. Not everybody gets caught. But if you ask the question this way, are there more baited hooks in the water now than there were 50 or 100 years ago? The answer is hell yes.
Well, that's the supply side, but it seems like maybe also on the demand side that there's less capacity for resisting these hooks. I had a podcast interview with a philosopher who wrote a book on alcohol, and he said, we've had alcohol forever, but it only became a problem when 2 things happened. One is the rise of distillation, right? So the concentration of the spirits into turbocharged spirits, but then also the breakdown of the cultural norms around drinking, where drinking used to occur only in social environments, and there was typically someone who was sort of dispensing the alcohol according to some accepted rules. So, I mean, are we also in a culture that is less capable of resisting all of these temptations?
Well, that's where I put on my historian's hat, and I would say, who's we? I think as a society becomes more anomic, or if it experiences some major disruption, yes, there is a kind of vulnerability, and there's been a lot of work on this, but you have to be chronologically specific, and you have to be culturally specific. If you were to ask me, were Native Americans in the wake of conquest particularly vulnerable to alcohol, I would say yes. I think that the disruption of their way of life by various European incursions, war, culture shock, and all the rest did play a role. On the other hand, if you look at, let's say, I'll use an economic example. Let's look at American society in the late 1940s, 1950s, and early 1960s. I think you would get near universal agreement that was the golden age of the American working class. when people talk about deindustrialization or they talk about neoliberalism or whatever they're talking about something that happens later in the 20th century. Agreed? And yet, if you look at that same period of time, you will notice a steady increase in per capita alcohol consumption, and that was also the golden age of cigarette addiction. So if American blue-collar workers were doing so great in the mid-20th century, as indeed most people think they were, why was the consumption of, and in the case of tobacco, addiction to, that particular product, why was that rising during that time period? Is that really about some kind of disruptive cultural shift or some kind of change in the zeitgeist that made people vulnerable? You see what I'm doing here? I'm trying to make a distinction that's important, which is I do think that cultural shifts and disruptions can play a role. But on the other hand, I want to warn against a position saying, oh, well, if nothing happens to change the demand side, we don't have to worry about supply and marketing of potentially addictive goods and services. We'll be fine because we'll be invulnerable to those changes. No, you won't, because there are dozens of counterexamples. I'd be happy to go on, but I think I've made my point.
Well, yeah, I mean, you also talk about these Quakers who were very active in the candy industry, right, in the 19th century.
Well, that's a kind of genie out of the bottle story. I don't think that what they had in mind was the sort of mass obesity and the sort of junk food industry of the late 20th and the early 21st centuries. See, that's the thing about this. That's why the only way to understand this really is historical, because in many cases, what happens is that there is a genuinely benign innovation. There's something that makes people's lives better and more pleasant. But then through technological enhancement, through mass production, through the cheapening of price, through the blending of certain pleasure-inducing products with other pleasure-inducing products. So, let's add sugar and other ingredients to that chocolate. Then it turns over time, it turns into something different and something that more people have trouble with. The amount of temptation, or to use a more neutral expression, the level of potential brain reward is going up and up and up and up. And you certainly see that in the digital realm as well.
Right. So, I mean, if you had to go through some complex ritual to get access to tobacco, which you would smoke at some ceremonial event, I mean, that's very different from having a vending machine that dispenses, right, packs of 20 cigarettes that are super cheap and are designed to, burn more quickly and taste really good and have high nicotine levels, right?
Exactly. And to give you another example, the first cigarette machine, the Bonsack machine, which went into production, I think, in 1881, could turn out 200 cigarettes a minute. Well, by the 1930s and 1940s, you had cigarette machines that were spewing out many thousands of cigarettes per minute. And of course, in it's blended flue-cured tobacco, which is a very different product from what, say, a Native American is smoking in the 17th century in a pipe. So you've got two things going on there. You've got a product that is more productive of burst release of dopamine, also easier to use, more available, and it's cheaper. And on top of that, let's not forget, heavily advertised, and at least by the 20s and 30s, advertised in a way that it's encouraging all groups, especially women who had previously been outside the realm of heavy tobacco consumption. It's encouraging everybody. The system is encouraging everybody to smoke.
Well, and you see a similar reduction in cost and cost of production and cost of access for things like pornography, right? So I guess in the 70s, somebody would have to go to some seedy part of town and go to some establishment, right, to encounter pornography, and now it's available for free on demand 24/7 through a variety of channels on one's phone, right?
And that's I think part of the significance of the internet is it's a kind of superhighway of vice. You don't have to go someplace to drink or to purchase pornography. It's all there online, and so accessibility is key, cost is key, and this indeed has changed. And again, to go back to the question you asked earlier about is all of this talk of addiction, is it just talk? No, it's not. And I think that the reason that people see this is that we live in an age of very rapid technological change, and nowhere is it more manifest, I think, than in the realm of limbic capitalism. These are real effects of real technological changes.
Now, the history of anti-vice activism in America, I mean, it seems like there's two strands. There's one that's religious and one that's secular. I mean, the religious one seemed to be the dominant one for most of our history, and the Prohibition movement, right, which had religious inspiration, right?
Well, it had both. In the 19th century, what you've got is a sort of coalition of people who fundamentally have a conservative religious worldview, and they regard things like drunkenness as sinful behavior and destructive of the family and other building blocks of Christian civilization. But you also have secular, highly educated, often medically trained reformers who say, well, this is creating epigenetic effects that are going to poison future generations. We can show how it's destructive of the liver and other vital organs. It takes years off the individual's life. Economists jump into the story by demonstrating externalities, especially in urban industrial civilizations. And these sides get along. It's surprising. Nobody's fooled. They understand that there are fundamental differences in outlook and worldview, but they come together behind what is a transnational movement to impose greater regulation and, in some cases, prohibition on products like alcohol or even cigarettes, and certainly narcotics, which is a huge issue. The global narcotic control regime also dates to the late 19th and the early 20th century. But during the 20th century, I would say that on the whole, the religious element, I wouldn't say it's dropped out exactly, but it's become second fiddle to the more scientific and public health discourse that now tends to dominate discussions of things like combustible tobacco products.
Yeah, I was surprised to see that water fountains were kind of created by these prohibitionists. That's kind of amazing. And also, I think cereal, right? So weren't the Kellogg's and those guys, weren't they reformists and prohibitionists? And they thought that, eating bran cereal was an alternative to drinking alcohol?
Well, I don't know that everyone who was a champion of a high-fiber diet or a vegetarian diet was necessarily a prohibitionist. And in fact, I can think of one or two examples of exceptions to that rule. But yes, broadly speaking, if you were to scratch the surface of a diet reformer in the late 19th century, chances are pretty good you would find someone who was at least a temperance advocate, if not an outright prohibitionist. So those things did correlate.
Mm-hmm. But these two movements had different remedies. So the religious folks are more likely to favor prohibition, and the secular folks are more likely to favor some kind of harm reduction, would call it maybe, or some kind of regulation or tax on these different addictive substances and activities?
Yes and no. It is true that the people who've advocated a more extreme root and branch solution to liquor trafficking were often Protestant evangelicals, often from rural areas. But it would be wrong to characterize all religious people who were concerned with alcohol as being prohibitionists, especially the high church folks. So that there's a kind of denominational layering here, where if you look at somebody who's an Episcopalian in, let's say, 1890, who's educated, who's concerned with social problems, who's part of the social gospel movement, yeah, they're going to be concerned with alcohol and the harm that it does to the working class in an urban environment, for sure. But they're not necessarily going to be in favor of prohibition. They might favor something like licensed, state-owned drinking establishments where the profit motive is taken away and you can invest in these enterprises, but you get 5% per year, period. The saloon keepers are all paid a standard wage, no tipping. There are police present on the premises to make sure nobody gets intoxicated. In other words, a regulated commerce in alcoholic beverages, but not prohibition. So generally speaking, the higher church you were, the more likely you were to go for that kind of a solution, as opposed to somebody who is a rural Protestant dry who says no, period, to alcoholic beverages.
So the idea is to put some frictions in the process of getting access, right?
Perfect word. And this is something that people misunderstand about the prohibition in the United States. The purpose was to introduce a lot of regulatory friction. If you look at the Volstead Act, the federal prohibition law, it's not really a prohibition law. It says, well, we allow a certain amount of home brewing, and you can get spirituous beverages with a doctor's prescription, and you can buy these things for religious rituals. It's not a flat-out prohibition. Same point about narcotics. The Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914, which went into effect in 1915, doesn't outlaw narcotics. It says you have to have a legitimate medical prescription in order to legally possess these drugs. And if you don't, then possession is evidence that you are guilty of violating the law. That's basically what it says. But that's not a prohibition. So, and that, boy, 5 books could come out of that story. I mean, that's what progressivism did in the early 20th century, is it tried to introduce various kinds of regulatory friction in problematic areas of the market for social benefit. And entrepreneurs of various stripes, not just limbic capitalists, but various entrepreneurs pushed back on ideological grounds. No, you're strangling the goose that lays the golden eggs. Regulation is going to wreck the system. You can't do that. Sorry, you just have to take the good with the bad. Or they push back for selfish reasons, which is we don't want this friction because the truth of the matter is that 80% of our profits come from the 20% of our customers who are dependent daily users. And thank you very much. We'll go on recruiting those people because without them, we're out of business. I mean, think about the multinational alcohol industry. If everybody drank exactly 1 glass of champagne on New Year's Eve, where would that industry be? You see, hormesis is good for society. If you take a little bit in a way that's beneficial and you have a good time and nobody gets hurt, that's great. But it's not good for multinational limbic capitalist bottom lines. And that is where the essential conflict is located.
Well, when we think of addiction today, I mean, you walk down the streets of San Francisco and you see some horrible scenes of addiction to things like fentanyl. And obviously, I mean, that's not legal. Right? It doesn't fall into the bucket of limbic capitalism as I think we would define it. But I think your point is that the much larger problems of addiction, much larger scale, involve things like food and the internet. And so maybe we could dig into each one of those and talk in particular about food. I read a statistic recently that said that 65% of the American diet is ultra processed. And so can we think of kind of a Dorito as a cigarette in that sense, right? Where we take something which may be okay in moderation, and we've kind of turbocharged it through science to make it more appealing and addictive?
Oh, sure. I mean, Michael Moss and others have written books on this about the engineering of what's often called hyperpalatable food. So a Dorito is a classic example of hyperpalatable food. And are you more likely to become a compulsive overeater because of the availability of hyperpalatable food? Sure. I mean, I think if we were all, eating berries and rice and drinking cold water, I think that institutions like Food Addicts Anonymous would would not exist. But again, it's another good example of the enhancement and also the blending of these products in a way that it increases temptation. So if you've noticed, when you go down the aisle in a grocery store and you get into the section where they have chips, including Doritos, you'll often notice that there are little displays of dips and sauces nearby. That's not a coincidence. Grocery stores are designed in a fashion to put, let's say, reinforcing products in proximity to one another, so that when you reach for that bag of Doritos, you say, oh, I've got to have some hot sauce to go with the Doritos. And so they're, again, it's not just the individual product, but it's the milieu in which these things are sold and also in which they're consumed.
Mm-hmm. Well, now with respect to what we call internet addiction or phone addiction, I mean, I think those are separate things. I think the phone is sort of enabled the internet addiction in ways that were simply not available when you were limited to your desktop. I know with gamers, it doesn't matter, right? Because I think you talk a lot about gamers in the book, and they obviously don't need to have a phone, but it seems like the phone has lowered the cost of accessing the internet to a point where you can be online more or less every waking moment.
Yeah, and it frees you from your desk. I mean, you don't have to sit in front of a clunky old desktop computer anymore to play your video game. I happened to take my wife to a dental appointment this morning. I was sitting in the waiting room, and I was actually preparing for this podcast. I was looking at some notes and rereading portions of the book and trying to think of snippy little things to say. And I glanced around the room, and every single person in that waiting room, regardless of his or her age, was like this. They had their nose stuck in their phone. And so the mobility of the device, plus the fact that the device has a camera, which makes possible all kinds of other social interactions, that makes it all the more appealing.
Well, to be clear, I mean, if you're reading long form journalism, or you're reading a book on the Kindle app, I mean, that's an activity that I don't think would fall into this bucket, right?
Oh, no. And Steven Pinker makes this point. Steven Pinker has written that, the internet has a bad reputation, but it's not really deserved, because you can go online and you can listen to Callas operas and you can study the works of Caravaggio and the whole world of culture and learning is open to you through the internet. And so I thought, well, that's a testable hypothesis. And so when I wrote The Age of Addiction, I sat down on my computer and I would enter things like callous arias, and then I would get X number of hits. And then I would enter things like how to grow cannabis. And then I would get, some multiple number of that. I recently repeated the experiment. I was invited to give a talk at the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville. I recently repeated that, and I found that you'll get 52 times the number of hits for growing cannabis, as opposed to Maria Callas arias if you do a standard search. So, yeah, of course. My productivity as a scholar tripled at least as a result of the digital revolution. But that doesn't mean that say, the consumption of pornography didn't increase 30-fold or whatever the number is. The trade-offs seem to be in the direction of limbic capitalism. That's where the advantage is, as opposed to old-fashioned scholarship or long-form journalism. Sure, I love the access that the internet gives me, and I'm sure you do too. And what we're doing right now is an example of that, but it's not necessarily a modal type.
Yeah, I mean, I think with respect to things like alcohol and other substances, we can imagine what it would be like to have a regulatory regime that would make access more difficult. But how can we think about that with respect to things like the internet? I mean, the business models of so many companies are based on people having this rapid fire dopamine, generation. What would be the equivalent of some kind of regulation that would kind of slow down or create frictions in the consumption of this content? Well,
so I think actually the problem is slightly different. So, how is a cigarette like a computer game or digital pornography? Well, they both produce burst release of dopamine. They're all of those things are potentially addictive, but it's actually easier to get at something like cigarettes or alcohol because they're physical objects that can be segregated in certain ways. You can, classic example, you can't smoke in this restaurant because your smoke is harming other people, and the waiter will ask you to leave if you're smoking. There are ways that you can enforce that. Or if you're running a convenience store, that if you try to sell beer to somebody who's underage, that somebody could be undercover for the police and you could lose your license. There are enforcement mechanisms that are realistic for those things. The problem with digital technologies and temptations is that it's almost impossible to opt out of those technologies. There are opt-in and there are opt-out technologies, right? And digital technologies, and in particular this thing, have become so integrated in our lives that it's almost impossible to be away from them. Possibly, as in China, there are screens and filters and regulations that can limit time on device, which is what the Chinese have done with internet gaming for young people. They've not forbidden it, but they've limited the amount of time. There are ways and means of getting at this, but I find it striking when you think about something like prostitution, which is a vice. That's something where you can raid the bordello, you can arrest the John, you can arrest the prostitute, you can prosecute the pimp. There are things that you can do, but it is just so much harder to get at the multiplicity of distractions and vices and addictions that are on this digital superhighway. That could change. I'm not necessarily, I don't want to sound unduly pessimistic. It's still early days in this revolution. And already we're in the midst of several states and school districts saying, I'm sorry, you park your cell phone at the door when you go to school. There are changes that are happening even as we speak. But I would concede your point that this is intrinsically difficult to do.
Well, in the book, you talk about brain science. And so there are some human universals that make us vulnerable to these addictions. But they do vary from society to society. There's a cultural element. And, in your other book, The Violent Land, you also talked about, biological factors that make young men violent. But there's lots of heterogeneity. So the United States is perhaps, among the most violent of countries. And this goes back to our unique history, right, of the frontier and, certain environmental conditions that kind of turbocharge this culture of violence. Is there any kind of parallel there with respect to our susceptibility to addiction? Or is there anything about American history that makes us maybe more likely to become addicted to things like the internet?
So I would say it's not just American history. I would say that there's a deep sociological principle, maybe even a universal, which is that vices are more likely to flourish in what I call bachelor societies. So if you have a bunch of young, unmarried men congregated in a place, whether it's an army camp or it's a frontier mining town or a cattle ranch, their behavioral patterns are going to be very different from a male of the same age who's, say, living in a residential neighborhood, who's married and has a family. I mean, the indulgence in vice, the likelihood of indulging in what contemporaries would have called vice, like consorting with prostitutes, getting drunk in a saloon, et cetera, is much higher for the people in the unsupervised, unparented, competitive, masculine group. And also, single men have less to lose. I mean, if you're a single man and you wade into a barroom fight, that's one thing. If you're a married man with a wife and 5 children at home, and you're you may not even be in the bar in the first place, but for sure you're not going to wade into that fight, or at least you're going to think twice before you do it. So another way to say this is that exposure is really key. Nobody becomes addicted to anything unless they're exposed to it. And exposure varies with social and cultural circumstance. And historically and cross-culturally, one of the places where especially young men are exposed at an impressionable age to vice is in these single male bachelor societies. So if you look at the so-called Chinatowns of the late 19th and the early 20th century, whether they're in the United States or in other places where the Chinese diaspora took root, or if you look at army camps during World War II, where people got introduced to cigarettes and alcohol, all that makes a difference. My own father, who died young because he was a smoker, was in the hospital as an 18-year-old in the U.S. Navy at the end of World War II. And he did not smoke. He grew up in a small town in southeastern Kansas. He did not smoke. And he got a case of hepatitis. He was in the hospital bed. They kept offering him cigarettes. He would give them away. People would start fighting over the cigarettes that he was just giving away. And he said, "Oh, fine, I'll smoke them myself." That's how he became addicted to cigarettes. That would not have happened if he had not gone in to the U.S. Navy. Now, it might have happened under some other circumstance later on. Who knows? But yeah, so social circumstance is a key variable in determining exposure to potentially addictive products.
Well, does the causation go the other way then? So in other words, does exposure to things like, I don't know, day trading and pornography make it more likely that men will remain single and kind of create bachelor societies?
That's a really fascinating question. I had not thought of that. But if you're suggesting that the phenomenon can be reverse engineered, that maybe some people are creating their own free-floating virtual pleasure meccas and just cutting loose from IRL in real life to lead carefree, independent lives in the virtual realm. Yeah, I mean, I've interviewed people who have described this kind of phenomenon. And in fact, I opened the book with a story of a young man.
So these are like
Swedish
virtual mining towns.
Exactly. And in fact, I talk about this young man I met at a conference in Cambridge in 2010 who said he was the last male graduate student left in his economic history program at a major Swedish university. And I said, what happened to all of your male counterparts? He said, they've dropped out and they're playing World of Warcraft. And is that also going to get in the way of their marrying and starting families? That's a reasonable hypothesis. Don't have data to support it, but I can think of a lot of anecdotal cases that would fit that model, yes.
Right, because we don't have the baseline economic characteristics that would give rise to these bachelor communities, right? I mean, we don't have, large-scale armies, and we don't have, or, single-sex armies. We don't have the mining towns as much as we did in the past.
Well, I don't agree with that, actually. There's if you rewind the clock about 30 or 40 years, there were societies in which male children were heavily favored, notably communist China and also in India. And there was a lot of sex-selective abortion, which sometimes goes under the kind of fancy term gendercide. But we know that at least for those particular cohorts, there was a huge imbalance in the number of males and females. And this circumstance created the so-called bare branch phenomenon of surplus males who don't really have anywhere to go, so to speak, because it's just not possible in a monogamous society for them all to find spouses. And yes, they are more inclined to drift into the world of vice and criminality than their married counterparts. And so there are, I don't know if you'd call them natural experiments exactly, but there are circumstances where we can see this phenomenon of the clustering of single males, and the results are not always pretty.
Now, you also mentioned that there's a whole nother industry which has arisen to try to deal with the consequences of the addiction industry, right? And in a ways, they're symbiotic. Now, I don't think that there's common ownership, but I kind of joke sometimes in my class that, Warren Buffett is a big shareholder in Coca-Cola. He's also a big shareholder in Davita, right, which is the dialysis company. And so he kind of gets the entire customer life cycle, right? Yeah. It's kind of as if Philip Morris was, in the ventilator business. I mean, to what extent can this industry counterbalance the limbic capitalism industry? Is there money to be made in the resistance to and suppression of addiction and vice?
I completely agree with the sentiment, but I balk at the words resistance to. It's more like cleaning up the messes of. Okay, so there's a secondary or derivative form of limbic capitalism that cleans up the problems that are generated by the primary forms of limbic capitalism, and so a society like Saudi Arabia will have a huge increase in obesity, and guess what? The bariatric surgeons are not far behind. Saudi Arabia has one of the highest rates of bariatric surgery in the world. So are those surgeons making a lot of money? Yes, they are. I don't know if that's a form of resistance to limbic capitalism. In the book, I use the phrase problem profit. There are all kinds of people who are making profit from the problems caused by limbic capitalism.
Yeah,
now,
I think what 5% of 5% of GNP is devoted to diabetes at the moment, I think. And I don't think that the, soda companies are making, 5% of GNP. It seems like there's more money. If you think of how much money is spent on drug treatment, I mean, that's got to be more than the folks who are selling fentanyl are making.
Well, I don't have any hard and fast statistics on that, but yes, they're making a lot of money. And yes, some of those industries are in fact abusive. They're churning patients, and there have been a number of scandals. Not all of them. I don't mean to imply that all drug treatment programs are exploitative or anything of that nature, but there have been some well-publicized scandals. So it is possible, certainly, for the problem responses to limbic capitalism to themselves go off the rails and become forms of criminality that in turn call forth a regulatory response, as has happened with the drug treatment industry.
Well, certainly, as someone who teaches in the business school, a lot of what we teach is, I guess, complicit in the marketing of and the development of products that appeal to people's addictive vulnerabilities. And so I think maybe it's something we need to address in our business school.
Right, and when you talk about addressing that, what does that mean? I mean, break that down. There are essentially three ways you can go in terms of policy in trying to rein in the excesses that are associated with potentially addictive goods and services. One is regulation. You can say, all right, fine, you can use this, but only if you're 18 years old, or you can use this only between certain hours of the day, no alcohol sales after midnight or whatever it is. Can't sell to intoxicated people. You have to have a prescription before you can have this drug, and on and on and on up the regulatory ladder until you get to total prohibition. So you can think of one axis of regulation as of policy rather as being regulatory, but the one that Greg, that people forget is taxes, because if you kind of think of this as a graph and you think of this as all right, you've got regulations, but you've also got taxes as another axis of policy. And taxes can range from nothing all the way, as John Stuart Mill said, to prohibition. It reaches a point where a man can't afford a drink, that's a kind of prohibition. He was right about that. And that's, to use your example of diabetes, that's why several nations have started imposing serious taxes on sugary beverages. It was a kind of joke in the United States. The liberals are going crazy again, and they want to tax your Mountain Dew or your Coca-Cola or whatever it is. In fact, in Mexico and in a number of other countries, this has advanced as a serious public policy proposal precisely because diabetes is off the charts. And then finally, the third, just to round out the thought, the third axis of policy is sanctions. So if somebody violates the regulations, or if somebody tries to dodge the taxes, what's the legal response? Do you slap them on the wrist? Do you impose a fine? Do you put them in prison? All the way up to what the Chinese still do for some forms of drug trafficking, which is to shoot them. And that's if I can just segue into the drug war for a minute, one of the things that strikes me is that a lot of the arguments that we have about the drug war and drug policy are not really so much about should this drug be scheduled or should you have to have a prescription for this drug. And they're not so much about taxes, but historically the arguments have really been, do you really want to impose a mandatory minimum sentence just because this person sold 50 grams of crack cocaine or whatever it was? That's where a lot of the political struggle has come in.
Well, look, I mean, it's easy to be cynical about companies like Philip Morris who fund anti-smoking campaigns, right? Or, some other I'm thinking of some other, the gambling casino companies that fund these, anti-gambling campaigns. But I mean, what else are they supposed to do? I mean, should they be lobbying for higher taxes? Would that make sense as a way of being more ethical when it comes to sales of the products? I mean, could casinos maybe be more attentive to the addictive habits of their customers? I mean, what can these companies actually do?
Well, they face a dilemma, and it's the Pareto principle, which I'm sure you've discussed on the podcast before, which is sometimes referred to as the principle of the trivial many and the important few. The reality of the situation is that they wouldn't be in business unless they had heavy consumers who account for most of their revenues. A Las Vegas casino takes in most of its money from repeat visitors, not from the person who shows up on a honeymoon, let's say, and, oh, honey, let's go put a few coins or in the slot machine or whatever. That's not going to keep them in business. They need to cultivate regular users, and they understand that the majority of their profits are going to come from the really heavy consumers. And at the edge of that heavy consumption is addiction. Now, what do? They basically respond with PR. They will distribute signs and leaflets in casinos. I've seen them myself saying, if you think you have a problem with gambling, call 1-800. Or they'll give money to, as the gambling industry did, for example, to researchers at Harvard University. The idea being, gee, find out what's wrong with a handful of individuals who, golly, just happen to have problems with gambling. We want to be able to identify those vulnerable few so we can segregate them, and warn them. But that's just all BS. That's not it. It's not just a handful of people. It clearly the way sports gambling has spread in, say, the last 10 years. We're not talking about some genetically susceptible minority. We're talking about the massification of what used to be called a vice through a very clever marketing campaign, which is tied in to surveillance capitalism. Something else we need to talk about is that limbic capitalism doesn't really exist nowadays in the digital world independent of surveillance capitalism, because one way to build up that heavy consumption base is to track people's habits and to encourage them to continue engagement with whatever product or service you are selling, and that will maximize your profits. So you use the word cynical. Yeah, I guess I am cynical about the PR effort to disguise what's really going on or to pretend that the industry is really trying to do something about it. On the other hand, it is an economic fact that it's going to be very hard for them to sustain business on anything like the current scale unless they have that 20% that produces 80% of their revenue. Yeah,
I mean, one option is just to always have it be very expensive. if every bottle of wine cost a lot of money, right? If every cigarette cost you $20, I mean, I think people would definitely smoke and drink a whole lot less.
David, if every time you place a bet online or in a casino, there is a tax on that somehow, that does lower consumption. But then you run into another paradox, which is then once the state becomes addicted, shall we say, to the revenue stream, then the state isn't necessarily interested in reducing the volume. And that's why I said earlier that when you talk about limited capitalism, it's just a mistake to say, oh, there's a handful of rogue capitalists who are foisting these products on people. No. They, historically anyway, have been in cahoots with governments and sometimes with criminal organizations.
Right. So the state tobacco monopolies in so many countries, and of course state casinos, right? State lotteries have been a big source of finance for governments.
Yeah, but the tobacco example is cause for optimism. So for decades, China, from the Communist Revolution right on up to the end of the 20th century, the Chinese government was just utterly complicit in encouraging heavy smoking because it derives so much revenue from this state tobacco monopoly. But then finally, the Chinese government realized, as did many other governments by that point, that it wasn't worth it in terms of the other costs that it was imposing on society. There were other better ways to gain revenue, and that's kind of a weapon in the arsenal of the anti-vice activists. One of the reasons that alcohol prohibition became possible in many countries was the introduction of the income tax. Mm-hmm. So when governments had an alternative to excise taxes on alcohol, suddenly either some kind of greatly restricted consumption model through regulation or outright prohibition, suddenly those alternatives become viable policies if you've got another source of revenue.
Mm-hmm. Well, David, thanks so much. Age of Addiction is a history of limbic capitalism going back to its early days, also violent land and forces of habit. Thanks for joining me.
Greg, thanks for having me. It's been a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.